On the 25th of December 2025, while the majority of Americans were gathered with loved ones, Donald Trump chose that specific moment to publicly degrade the United States' most steadfast partner. His actions went beyond simple critique or the threat of trade barriers. He once again proposed that Canada should effectively forfeit its independence and be absorbed as the 51st state. He treated a sovereign neighbor like a minor dependency that existed solely to serve the interests of the American capital. The reaction from the Republican leadership was marked by a total lack of response. Representatives from regions whose economies are deeply linked to Canadian trade stayed quiet, and party officials who frequently speak of protecting domestic labor looked away. No one cautioned Trump that disparaging a primary economic partner during a holiday period could lead to serious repercussions. However, a development occurred that few in the political sphere had foreseen. The Canadian public did not wait for their administration to implement official trade barriers. They didn't require legislative debates or new laws. They opted for a much simpler yet significantly more impactful path. They stopped purchasing American goods, starting quietly, and then expanding until the movement became too massive to overlook. What materialized was the most significant grassroots consumer boycott in Canada's modern history, and it was far from aimless. It was precise, tactical, and incredibly potent. The movement targeted sectors that had traditionally provided financial backing to Trump and the Republican platform businesses that had invested heavily in political influence, assuming their loyalty would shield them from market fallout. Among these sectors, one particular industry suffered more than the rest. The American bourbon industry. Bourbon is more than a simple product. It is a core element of American heritage, particularly in regions like Kentucky. For decades, Canadian hospitality venues featured American bourbon as their primary offering, with staff and patrons choosing it by default. It was a cultural staple, and that deep integration is exactly why the loss of that market has been so devastating. The data reveals a harsh reality, as bourbon shipments to Canada have plummeted by nearly 85%. This isn't a minor fluctuation or a brief downturn. It represents the near total evaporation of a market built over many decades, and the damage is now impossible to ignore. A legendary American spirits producer recently declared it would halt operations at its primary distillery for a full year. This site, which had been running without interruption since the 1,930 seconds, is now going silent. Roughly 1,500 union employees who had no part in creating this geopolitical friction are now facing an unstable future. Households that relied on steady industrial roles are seeing layoffs simply because Donald Trump decided to provoke Canada on Christmas. The justifications provided by corporate leaders are revealing, not because they are believable, but because they highlight the severity of the crisis. We hear talk of infrastructure improvements, stock management, and vague claims about the shifting tastes of younger drinkers. None of these excuses hold up under close inspection. Output has already crashed, and sales to Canada, once a pillar of the export market, have completely dried up. Yet, the industry hopes the public will believe this is a mere coincidence, suggesting that a market failure of this size is unrelated to the visible political tension. Local reporters in Kentucky are not convinced, and they are directing their audience to look north for the real explanation. What makes this situation so perilous for American producers is the nature of consumer behavior. Once a long-standing habit is broken, it does not simply return when politics shift. When Canadian establishments pulled American bourbon, they didn't stop serving spirits. They simply transitioned to other options. They embraced Canadian rye, Irish whiskey, Scotch, Japanese varieties, and high-end spirits from global craft producers. In the process, both the hospitality industry and the public realized they didn't rely on American bourbon as much as they had assumed. This is the ultimate fear for any established brand, not just temporary anger or a passing protest, but actual indifference. It is the realization by the consumer that a product is easily replaced and that life goes on quite well without it. Brand loyalty is nurtured over generations, but it can be shattered in an instant. Once buyers establish new routines and find alternatives they prefer, they rarely go back to the original brand just because a dispute is resolved. Even if formal trade talks resume or new treaties are signed, the damage at the retail level is permanent. This isn't just a theory, the proof is visible across various companies. Another major spirits producer reported significant layoffs months ago, citing a steep decline in Canadian revenue. Those figures were noted even before the boycott reached its peak and before the social movement to avoid American goods became a standard practice in Canadian life. Smaller operations have been impacted even more severely. One notable Kentucky producer has already sought bankruptcy protection, and the subsequent events are a warning sign for the entire industry. When the firm tried to use its aging inventory as security for a rescue loan, the court declined. Expert analysis made it clear that the secondary market for whiskey barrels, once seen as a rock-solid investment, had essentially vanished. The legal ruling was blunt. Selling that stock would require massive price cuts, assuming any buyers existed at all. This means an entire category of assets, which had served as a financial safety net for years, was gutted almost instantly. Only a decade ago, the American whiskey sector was in a golden period. Exports were surging, new distilleries were popping up across the South, and investors were pouring money in. Experts predicted endless growth for a product that had become a global symbol of American skill and tradition. International buyers weren't just purchasing a liquid. They were buying into a legacy and a specific image of authenticity. That reputation took nearly a century to cultivate, and it has been compromised not by market trends or better competition, but by a self-inflicted wound from a leader who failed to understand the mechanics of modern economic power. The political aspect of this is impossible to overlook. Many of the firms now experiencing these losses were major donors to Republican causes. They made strategic investments in politicians who promised less regulation and better business conditions, believing these ties would safeguard their profits. Instead, those very ties made them a primary target. There is a dark irony in seeing the economic fallout hit the exact industries and workers who supported Trump's rise. Kentucky, the center of the Bourbon world, supported Donald Trump by a wide margin, and now those same workers are losing their livelihoods because of his disregard for diplomatic norms. Perhaps more shocking than the economic decline is the total silence from the American political class. Senators from states where this industry is vital have said nothing. Leaders who claim to be the champions of the working class have refused to challenge the individual whose actions caused this. High-paying union jobs are being lost, and historic facilities are closing. Yet the people elected to protect these communities are nowhere to be found. This lack of action is not an accident, it is a calculated choice. These politicians see the damage, but they have decided that opposing Trump is a bigger risk than letting their own voters face financial ruin. This stands in sharp contrast to the situation in Canada. The nation that was supposed to buckle under American pressure is instead thriving. Canada's economy has proven to be incredibly sturdy throughout this ordeal. Recent data shows that employment is growing, and the jobless rate has hit a yearly low. Economists are noting that Canada is entering a period of significant growth. The country Trump tried to bully did not submit, it adapted. And they achieved this without needing government mandates. They simply stopped rewarding hostility with their business. This was the result of millions of individual choices. It was the decision of regular people to stop funding businesses from a country that insulted them. It was the choice of business owners to diversify their stock. These small actions added up until the economic weight could no longer be ignored. This is what Donald Trump failed to grasp about modern power. You can use government tools to threaten and posture, but you cannot force an individual to spend their money on your brand. You cannot bully someone into being a loyal customer, and you cannot use intimidation to regain lost trust. Once that bond is broken, no trade deal can fix it. No diplomat can make a bartender in Toronto feature your product, and no threat can make a shopper in Vancouver ignore the better alternatives they have discovered. Trump began this fight assuming Canada had no other choice. He believed that sheer economic scale meant he would win and that pressure would lead to surrender. He was entirely mistaken, and now American workers are paying for that error. What we are seeing is something Trump cannot control. This isn't a deal that can be made in a boardroom or an order that can be signed away. It is a movement of millions of people making quiet, daily decisions to move their money elsewhere. There is no political tool that can force them to change their minds. This is what truly worries those who understand the market. Reports suggest that in trade talks, Trump has demanded that the Canadian government somehow force American spirits back onto shelves. The arrogance in that request is staggering. He insults a nation, questions its right to exist, and then expects their loyalty to remain intact. That is not how people or markets function. You can push a government, but you cannot command a consumer's heart or a bartender's hand. Once people realize that their personal spending power has a global impact, that influence doesn't just go away. This is where Trump's logic fails. He views power as something that only comes from the top down, but consumer movements work horizontally. They don't need a leader or a central plan. They exist outside of government control, making them resistant to political pressure. Even if a new agreement is reached tomorrow, the reality on the ground has changed. Canadian shoppers will still pass by the American brands, and bars will keep serving the new favorites they've found. The trust is gone, and the brand image is stained. This is not a temporary problem. It is a structural shift that will be felt for years. The personal cost of this situation is immense. Behind every closed factory are people whose lives have been turned upside down. Families who had secure jobs are now facing a terrifying future, and none of them asked for this conflict. Donald Trump will never feel the weight of these consequences himself. He won't worry about bills or health care. That burden stays with the workers, while the leaders who could have spoken up chose to remain silent. This is the result of power without responsibility. Trump has spent his life avoiding the fallout of his choices, but this time there is no legal trick or political spin that can fix the loss of consumer trust. This is a judgment being made every day by millions of people. And that decision is final. Trump thought bullying was a sign of strength, but instead, he is seeing American industries wither under the weight of his own actions. That is the true crisis currently unfolding.